Hi, well, today's topic is something that's vital to maintaining a stud of exhibition budgigars, and that is the buying uh, of birds for your stud. And I'm going to try to talk about some general topics, uh, and one of the main topics, at least in my mind, is that the only important bird show in the world is the one that's in your aviary. So on a daily basis, it's not at all about winning and losing, but it's about being happy with the birds you have. So if you are not happy with the birds in your aviary, that is a very bad situation. And the only remedy is probably going out and buying a bird or two or more. Um, and of course, that means that the lifeblood of an aviary is purchasing of new stock, and that is a lifeblood. Many things go into this, including timing and being aware of when breeders in your area and also that you're hoping to buy birds from have birds for sale that you might be interested in. And as you know, that mate is usually not, it is seasonal and although can vary from breeder to breeder. And only a telephone call or your knowledge of his breeding season is helpful in knowing what time of year to come. And so, so all breeders, no matter how good they are, need to sell birds. Otherwise, you'd end up with 1,000 birds and you wouldn't know what to do with them besides the rest of the fancy needs birds. And I was reminded of this about 40 years ago when I first was in England buying birds. And I ran into the intermediate breeder of the year. Her name was Joan Sanguin. She had some absolutely fabulous birds based on Mrs. Moss and Maurice Finey. And I went to her, I saw her at a show, and I think I might have called her, and I asked her, I said, well, Mrs. Sanguin, do you have any birds for sale? And then she made this comment, which I have just given, we all have to sell birds? And I thought that was kind of profound. The reason I chose her was that she seemed to be a very clever breeder, and she had birds from people that I did not have access to those studs. And so I went to her because I was actually buying around the studs I was trying to buy, the kinds of birds I was trying to buy. And so I bought birds, about 4 or 5 birds from her, and they were very, very nice birds. Eventually I brought them back to the country, and I traded those birds, well, at least one of them, 1 or 2 of them, to a major champion breeder for 4 hens, very nice hens. And he took the bird that had Joan, he took Joan Sanguin's bird and bred a series of best in show birds off of that bird. And I took 1 of the 4 hens and I bred 3 best in shows in a single nest. So trading birds, buying birds, the birds that you buy, you may not want to keep. You may bring them back and trade them for other birds, depending on what you need, particularly what your friends need, can take advantage of that. Incidentally, the year that I bought them, in 1979, Joan Sanguin did win Best in Show at Torbay, and therefore she beat Mrs. Moss and everybody else that was at the show. It's a kind of a peak of her success. I saw her stud, and she seemed to be a clever breeder. So by a clever breeder, I mean somebody who takes sort of ordinary birds, and every year the birds are better. So if your birds, in assessing your own breeding skill, if your birds are not at least as good or better, every year, then you need to sort of either reassess the birds you have or your breeding plan, the way you're breeding your birds. So when I'm basically buying a bird, I'm interested in adding traits which my stud needs and your stud would need. So I want to talk about individual characteristics here of buying birds, important features, and size is a very, very important feature. Over the course of time, almost all people's birds, unless they're very selectively breeding or clever breeders, they will lose size without outcrosses. And also feather, obviously, if you have size but no feather, your birds are going to be at a disadvantage on the bench. And then adding to that, a third sort of characteristic that I look for, and I'm sure you do too, is head. And there are two aspects to head qualities. One is the face of the bird. These birds have different kinds of faces, and I probably will discuss that in a different video. But the primary characteristic of head is the volume of the head. So it isn't just, I hear people talk about the size of the heads, but that's not the way I think about heads in budgicars. Exhibition budgies are really a puzzle, and they're pieces of the puzzle that your birds may not have. They may have everything, but in terms of adding pieces, you have to sort of look at your birds and decide which, if any, kind of, as I said, piece they're missing. Size actually may be a piece of that puzzle. Breedability might be a piece in the puzzle, because size and breedability is a characteristic of these birds that in studs that have not had outcrosses on a routine basis tend to lose fertility and as I've said again, size. You have to look a little bit at what you're looking for, what you need. But there's another component, and that component is having the opportunity to buy a good bird, even though it might not be exactly what you think you need. And my rule of thumb over the last 60 or almost, well, 60, 65 years is I never ever pass up a good bird. And so you have to go into an aviary if you're going to buy birds in an individual's aviary, and I recommend you do that. But when you go in there, you have to go in with an open mind based on, even if you've gone to the aviary a dozen times, those aviaries change a lot every few months. Birds are born, birds hatch, birds die, and the number and kinds of birds that someone that you're interested in buying birds from would change. So you have to go, I think you have to go with an open mind. I know people have come to me looking for a certain kind of bird, and they found that bird, and they left with the bird. I think they were happy with them. However, I know that they left several birds that I thought they should have taken. Not that I'm trying to sell more birds, but sometimes you don't want to get blinded by what you think you need based on what the breeder has. He may have something that is not exactly what you're looking for, but is an actually super bird, and the kind of bird you can't afford not to take away with. So when you get there, again, you get to the stud in the aviary, you have to pour over the birds, particularly if it's the first time, or I'd argue even the 10th time. Pour over the stud, because you really don't know what the breeder has at the time you're walking in. You don't know what he exactly values in his birds and what he may have an excess of. So I try to go see, if I'm going to an aviary, and I try to go through basically every bird in the aviary. And not only are no two studs the same, but the birds, the birds change, as I said, within those studs. So the harder you work for your birds in the aviary, when you go to the buy birds, the better your results are going to be. And I think that, again, many of us who breed these birds all our lives, we're impressed with people who approach these birds in an organized way and are not afraid to spend time in the aviary, including going through the nest boxes. And I'll describe what you would be looking for in nest boxes anyway. One thing that I do have done over the years, as I said, many people come and they know exactly what they're looking for. However, sometimes they take advice, and we're looking at birds, and I tend to give them honest advice. It is important to be comfortable with the bird guy you're buying from, the woman you're buying from, and you have to have, because these birds are difficult to evaluate, and he or she would certainly know more about their birds, hopefully, than you would, even if you spent a lot of time there. Buying birds is actually a very risky endeavor, because you're actually buying, you're looking at one thing, but you're actually buying faults. What kind of faults? Well, length or breedability or even disease. There are faults in these birds, hidden and unhidden. So when you come away with this, even with a super bird, that bird will have faults which you may have had to ignore because the bird is too good not to pass up. But recognizing that in the first generation, your F1 generation, depending how many hens or cocks you breed the bird to, you will notice immediately that the birds are even the high quality birds, or there's a large variation in the birds, or as you might unfortunately have happen, the birds are all much poorer quality, in which case that particular line, no matter what happens, what you've had to pay for that bird and the amount of time and effort you've devoted to that bird, you would have to probably discard the line. That is slightly a breeding issue, which I want to take up in a breeding theory, and I want to take up in a different lecture. So, but the point is, this point of this particular notion is that you want to buy as few faults as you possibly can to get the kind of bird you actually need. So another sort of, I have purchased birds in the sales classes at the club show, and purchased birds that people brought to shows in these little wire cages. And visually they were fine, and they all bred fine. So I think looking around, the opportunity to buy birds, now that travel is somewhat more difficult, when you go to the shows, you want to, no matter who you are, you want to go and see if people have something that you might be able to find useful in your stud. But particularly as let's say beginners, first-time beginners, novices, and even intermediates, you really want to select the breeder before you select the bird. Because over the course of time, if you want to build something and you like the guy's birds, he has tremendous birds, and that's the direction you want to go with your birds, you'll probably go back there time after time. When you go to an aviary, particularly for the first time, and you're trying to evaluate the stud, what I do is, in my habit all my life, is to look for the worst birds. And so I go back and I find the worst bird, then I find the next worst bird, and let's say go up about 5 or 10 birds. And what I'm looking for, I'm trying to figure out why somebody who I think should have an even stud, I'll talk about in a minute, should have an even stud, has a lot of variation in their birds. That variation, it means to me that the birds are not breeding true. In other words, when you're breeding birds, all of which have big heads, or all of which are large and very nice, erect typey birds, some of the birds in the aviary, or a certain portion of them, will obviously not be that way. Well, the question is, what major faults are they showing in the birds that he is, you're not interested in, but you should be interested in if you're going to buy birds from that particular person over the course of years. So I have always been a little alarmed because I have seen a number of aviaries around the world, really, that have had very uneven quality. And when you see that, to me, that is a little alarm, somewhat of an alarm sign. And so at that point, when you see that unevenness, you can't really buy a bird that does not show visual qualities that you want, perfect visual qualities that you want, because you can already see these birds are not breeding true. I tend to look at once I've looked at the birds, I never exactly go to the sale flight or all the things that people sort of normally do. I try to see if he's interested in looking at, letting me see what's going on in the nest boxes. I'm not necessarily specifically focused on the nest boxes, but I am focused on the pairs. And I'm looking around and I'm trying to figure out by looking at the pairs what kind of birds he should be breeding, and the way that he actually pairs his birds. It tells me a little look inside his mind as to how he is putting these birds together, because as I said to you initially, these birds are actually parts of our puzzles. And also, in looking in those nest boxes and looking at the pairs, you might well get some hints about how to breed at least his birds. You could come away with learning something whether you buy a bird or not. A lot of times, in particularly aviaries that have major breeders where they frequently do not have birds for sale, even if you go, you can certainly come away with, number one, the way he's breeding his birds, and two, also who he might have sold birds to. Because, as I said, some of the major breeders have a lot of pressure on them, and you could find out who around his area he has been selling birds to, and of course, because of the sort of sensitivity of these things, you might want to ask if it would be all right if you went to somebody else to get birds that were bred from his, even though he can't let you have the birds you want or need. But once you see a stud where you really see no bad birds, and that you could be comfortable buying any bird in the aviary, and there are quite a few studs that are like that. Once you see that, then there's no more, even if you buy a very average bird, something that somebody else has passed up, then you will generally speaking, come away with a less expensive bird, and that bird, to me, has equal chance of breeding something that's outstanding as opposed to something you would pay an awful lot of money for. What this requires to do what I'm asking you to do, or asking you to think about, it's called an eye. And you have to have an eye for a bird. And, well, what does that actually mean? That means being able to look in a flight of 50 birds and seeing the one or two birds that have some little special quality that that those two birds or three birds or even one bird would be the best birds in the flight of 50 birds, including just a sail flight. Inside sail flights, it isn't just the bird that you think the biggest or the best or whatever. You will see this this feature that this feature that the bird has that sort of sets it apart from all the rest of the birds. And this ability to see these birds and to have an eye and to judge these birds, that is vital also in all your breeding birds, because you have to have an eye inside the pair of birds that you breed as to what those birds will breed. And so obviously you probably don't need to have an eye when you show birds, because you really should show as many birds as you have show cages in every show, so it wouldn't make any difference to me. I tend to use the numbers theory, where I show a lot of birds, 20, 30 birds at every show, every cage, fill every cage I have, because I never quite know which birds are going to win. But eventually you will need that eye if you ever intend to judge budgies, because that eye will allow you to immediately separate the qualities of birds which appear to be the same, but probably are not. Actually, as you know, having good birds and selling good birds are two different things. So I tend to, as I've mentioned, to differentiate breeders that I think are clever breeders. Those breeders are consistently breeding better birds than they bought. That is an important thing for you to notice, both when you're buying birds and even inside your own studs. And then gifted breeders, I think of them as people who are on top bench all the time. They have many, if not hundreds of good birds. All of those are really, really outstanding birds in one way or another. And so that, as I said before, an apparently inferior bird bred from these super pairs of birds are birds that you would want to get a hold of, particularly if you're on a limited budget. You do not have to buy. I've been buying birds all my life, seemingly all my life, and you do not have to pay a ton of money to breed really outstanding birds. Then going on, so there's birds that people think of clever breeders, and then gifted breeders who have these incredible numbers of birds. But the major breeders in this world, of which there may be 10 or 20 of them, those people have trouble. They have trouble letting birds go because they have pressure on their birds. They would have pressure even from other major exhibitors, other champions, because those people are they have reference Avery, and they are called reference. It's an actual cattle term. So they have bear breeding birds to standard and beyond, and so getting useful birds out of them is sometimes difficult, and it's not their fault, because it's nobody's fault, because they just have a lot of pressure on their birds. So the important thing, though, is to go to them over and over again, become friendly with them, and then it takes a lot of, I would say, hard work. Even when you're in the aviary, it takes a lot of hard work, flying around the country, driving around the country, looking for birds. But in general, like so many things, the harder you work, the more rewards you will get. I remember I've seen many birds, bought many birds in aviaries that had 300 or 400 birds in them, and I actually ended up buying the birds that were down in the resting flights, birds that they had discarded, birds that you had to get down on your hands and knees to find, and that does require, as I've said to you just recently, that does require an eye. You have to be able to look at a cage full of birds and realize that even though the birds are sort of out of the way and down someplace else, that in that little stock cage of 20 birds, there's one or two that are really outstanding, even though they would not be the standard that the guy is keeping himself or any of his top birds. And I recall decades ago going to a very famous breeder by the name of Norman Bayer looking for some hens, and we had been in the aviary for about I don't know, half a day, several hours looking for birds, and I had come away with a couple of them. But I was traveling at that time with one of my aviary assistants, and he had, over the first couple of years, had developed a very good eye, and just as we were leaving, I felt him pull on my shirt sleeve and say, "Boss, look down here." And sure enough, down in one of the bottom cages that Norman had not remembered he had was a very, very nice pied hen that was far and away the best bird that we took home that day. I would like to remind you that it is a hobby, and the more friends you have, the more fun you're going to have, better time you're going to have in the fancy, and the easier it is, number one, to enjoy people around you, and also actually acquire birds, the things that you really sort of would like to get that are sometimes hard to come by unless you have friends. So, as I said, it's useful to make, particularly it's useful to making good and lasting friendships from major breeders. And one or two or three major breeders. Eventually you will become a major breeder if you stay with this long enough. Because in any one given year, if you're looking for birds, any one or two given breeders might not have the kind of season or the kind of birds available that you actually need to advance your stud, or at least stay even. Among other things, I must admit, I've talked about hard work and all that sort of thing, but really the truth of the matter is, when buying birds and breeding birds, you really need to be lucky. And one of the lucky sort of things that will happen to you, you had a long enough career, is you will be around at a time that someone is selling out the fancy, selling out his birds. And so at that time, you have a very, very rare chance to have the very best birds in the aviary, either, going in with other people, buying individual birds. If he's selling individual birds, usually they don't. They sell them all at one time. But certainly if you can be there with other people to buy the stud out, that is can be a life changer in your life of your stud. Among many things I search for, I think we all search for, is honesty in people who are selling their birds. Now, it is true that you're not taking the person home that you're buying birds from, and I have bought birds from people who were, let's say, less than honest, to be charitable, and some of the birds did fine. As long as you examine the birds carefully, and I'll talk to you a little bit about that in a minute, as long as you examine the birds carefully, as I said, you're not taking him home, and you're not living with him or her. So what you do have to take care of is you have to make sure that the birds are healthy. And in general, you need to focus at least some part of your attention on the general cleanliness of the aviary, and the health of not just the birds you're taking home, but sort of the general health of the birds in the aviary. I have purchased birds from aviaries that were not very clean, but I carefully handled all the birds, and they were all quarantined anyway, and those birds bred fantastic birds. So I don't really limit myself. I know what I really want when I'm buying birds, but from people I'm buying birds from. I want to be able to go back year after year. I want them to have a very even stud of birds. I want their birds to be very breedable. I want their birds to be better than they actually bought. Those are pretty high standards. So, but I think in general, it's something that if all things being equal, I think you will be somewhat safer in introducing birds in your aviary that from an aviary that is clean and the birds are well cared for. You absolutely have to, before the bird leaves the aviary, you have to feel the bird, you have to pick the bird up, you have to make sure the body weight is right, generally make sure the vent is clear of any abnormal droppings, and also nasal discharges and things like that that would eliminate a bird from ever coming into your aviary. So I cannot overemphasize picking a bird up and assessing its size, because feathers can mask a bird that is actually a very small bird. And sometimes, since these birds are more or less, as Jeff Atwood says, are more or less an illusion created by feathers, just looking at the birds is not really sufficient when you're, even if you're going to, particularly if you're going to spend more money than you normally do on birds. I just encourage you to pick the birds up. The reputation of a breeder is a long-time breeder. That is very, very important, because you are actually looking for, as I've said over and over again, critical in these birds, and that is breedability, vigor, and at this point in time, you have to be extraordinarily careful for not introducing birds that have feather problems of any kind, particularly missing tails, missing flights, birds that have these new sort of abnormal hereditary problems where their tails never grow. And certainly it's okay to buy faults. I bought a lot of faults, particularly in my younger years when I didn't have a lot of money. And I recall one particular case in the 1950s. I bought a bird from a stud that was doing very, very well. They had fabulous birds, were winning a lot of shows, but in that stud I called them and they said they had one bird that wasn't very good, but it was the biggest bird they bred. And so I bought the bird and I brought it home, and sure enough it had a drop tail and some postural issues. Which normally would eliminate it, but it was the best bird I could afford, and I was able to acquire a hen that these were both light greens. They were both square-headed birds. The hen was much better head qualities. I don't want to say they were perfect, but they were very, very good. And I bred those birds together in 1956. They bred about 8 or 9 birds, and those birds were on top bench for 3 more years. And so that's really, it is really saying that you can buy faults as long as you eliminate that. The reason I want to tell you a little bit about that one particular bird is that all the rest of his brothers and sisters were absolutely perfect. All of them were best in show, but this one bird was huge, a giant, one of these huge, giant, ugly budgies that just in some ways you wouldn't take a second to look at unless you had a hen that could correct all the faults in that bird, and then lucky enough for them to nick so that but you would produce the birds that you were trying to produce. I want to talk to you a little bit about flecking. This has obviously got to be a big problem. I do buy fleck birds. I try never to buy flecked cocks, and as long as I never buy flecked cocks, I feel as though I can buy all the flecked hens I want, plus keep a line of red eyes, and I tend to bury the flecking in the red eyes, which helps the flecking disappear. And the truth of the matter is, if you never keep any flecked cocks and you only keep half your hens are flecked, you'll never have more than 25% of the birds in the aviary at any one given time that are flecked in any way. So it is hard work, but persistence is key. And again, as I said, it helps to be lucky. Again, if you're into an aviary for the first time and you've not dealt with this person before, it is, once you're done buying, sometimes people say to me, what did I miss? And I try not to guide them in any particular way. Did they come in, they want this, they want that, but occasionally, and they'll say, well, what did I miss? And I will show them what I thought, that a bird that they didn't see or saw discounted, or maybe a bird that I never even offered them, that I got to thinking about, well, maybe based on the other birds they bought, maybe this bird would be very good for them. You want to take your time, if you can, looking in the nest boxes, because what you'll see in the nest boxes are also cleanliness and health of the babies. But at 3 weeks old, the birds are first in pins. Their skull structure is immediately apparent. And to me, the next time you can assess a bird's skull structure is probably when they're a year to 18 months old, when they reappear the way they were in the nest box when they were in pin feathers. So I look at the head structure, perfectly round, and that tells me that these birds are going to have incredibly good quality heads. Because as in my other sort of little discussion sessions, I've talked to you about skeletal structure, which I think is sort of not, I would say, not paid attention to like I think you should. So because I'm someone who breeds square-headed birds, I tend to look for people who are also breeding square-headed birds, and then it's just a matter of looking for head qualities and length and size and deportment. I haven't mentioned that too much today, but you certainly do not want to buy any birds that lay over the perch and have bad deportment. But and then I've also talked a little bit about looking for birds that you are sort of interested in birds that you came to get. But if someone offers you a useful bird, I would say grab it. I don't care what color it is. I don't care what sex it is. Useful birds, special birds are very, very hard to come by. So at the end of the day, the best option for you is to breed birds that are so good that you actually don't have to buy birds, that you can actually take your best birds and trade for birds. And that is how the best breeders in the world get around. They actually don't buy very many birds, if any, but they trade. Their birds are so good, and they trade, half a dozen birds a year, maybe more, and they constantly get this new infusion of blood in their stud, and those birds, many times they've actually sold the birds that they're getting back, so the bloodline is actually the same. And they just build on this characteristic vision in their mind. Because if you don't have the vision in your mind, you're not going to be able to produce these birds one after another like postage stamps. And you do have to have the confidence in your ability that if you buy 2 birds, that in 6 months or a year and a half, you'll have 6 to 8 birds from that pair of birds. And those birds will, at least half of them, be better than the birds you bought. That's the key issue. So you need to be breeding better birds than you bought. Because if you're not breeding better birds, it's either your skill or the birds you were buying, studs you were buying from, are studs you need not to go back to, because those birds are not working for you, and they're not breeding better birds, which is why you are out buying birds. So the final initial goodbye is please don't ignore the fact that when looking for an outcross, the only thing you might be needing to do is to increase the vigor and fertility in your own birds, and that would be the only reason you actually are going out to get an outcross. So thanks for watching. I hope it's useful, and I'll try to have a couple, three more about breeding and showing birds, selling birds, and other little topics, bird aviary management that you might find useful. Thanks.